For much of the post-World War II era, the relationship between the United States and its allies followed a predictable pattern. Disagreements existed, tensions surfaced, but the foundation remained intact. Within NATO, American leadership was not simply accepted, it was expected. The alliance was built on the assumption that the United States would provide strategic direction, military capability, and political continuity. In return, allies aligned their security policies around that expectation. This arrangement endured through decades of global change. The Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the expansion of NATO eastward. Through each phase, the basic logic remained the same. Stability flowed from consistency. Consistency did not mean unanimity. European allies often disagreed with Washington over tactics, priorities, and regional interventions. But these disagreements unfolded within a shared framework. There were rules, there were channels, there was predictability. Even when tensions rose, allies could anticipate how far disagreements would go and where they would stop. That predictability created trust. Part 2: How has foreign policy set the tone? For decades, American foreign policy played a dual role. It projected power outward, shaping global events. At the same time, it reassured allies inward, signaling reliability. Military presence was only part of this equation. Equally important were commitments to multilateral institutions, shared decision-making, and long-term strategy. From NATO councils to international summits, the United States positioned itself as a convening power, a country that coordinated rather than dictated. This role was not universally loved, but it was broadly understood. Over time, this understanding became embedded in Allied planning, defense budgets, force structures, diplomatic priorities. Many allies built their security assumptions around American engagement, not blind trust, but structured reliance. That reliance reduced uncertainty, and in international politics, reducing uncertainty is often more valuable than reducing threats. Part 3: When the signals began to change. The first signs of concern among NATO allies did not emerge suddenly. They appeared gradually, in shifting language, in altered diplomatic tone, in moments where expectations and outcomes no longer aligned. Allies began noticing gaps between stated commitments and practical follow-through. Decisions appeared more transactional. Consultation sometimes felt secondary. Long-term strategy gave way to short-term leverage. Individually, these moments seemed manageable. Collectively, they suggested a change in posture. This shift did not necessarily reflect hostility toward allies, but it did reflect a redefinition of priorities. American foreign policy increasingly emphasized flexibility over structure, leverage over predictability, and immediacy over continuity. For allies accustomed to stable signaling, this created unease, not because alliances were collapsing, but because their contours were becoming less clear. Part 4: Why uncertainty matters to allies. For NATO members, uncertainty carries tangible consequences. Defense planning depends on assumptions about support, coordination, and escalation thresholds. When those assumptions blur, planning becomes harder. Allies must prepare for multiple scenarios rather than a single shared framework. That preparation is costly, financially, politically, strategically. More importantly, uncertainty affects trust. Trust is not built on perfection, it is built on expectation. Allies can manage disagreement, they struggle with unpredictability. When foreign policy signals fluctuate, allies are forced to hedge. They diversify partnerships. They pursue greater autonomy. They explore alternatives that reduce dependence on any single actor. These steps do not indicate abandonment. They indicate adaptation. Part 5: When policy started to feel transactional. As concerns grew among NATO allies, a common theme began to surface in private discussions. American foreign policy no longer felt anchored primarily in long-term structure. It increasingly appeared shaped by short-term leverage. This shift did not happen in a vacuum. It emerged alongside a broader rethinking of costs, commitments, and returns. Alliances were no longer discussed only as security frameworks, but as arrangements that needed to justify themselves continuously. For allies accustomed to strategic continuity, this reframing felt unfamiliar. Security guarantees, by their nature, depend on credibility over time. When they are treated as negotiable, their stabilizing effect weakens. In practical terms, this transactional tone changed how messages were received. Statements that once reassured now raised questions. Requests that once felt routine now carried implicit conditions. Even when outcomes remained unchanged, the process altered perceptions. Allies began asking not only what decisions were being made, but how and why. That distinction matters, because alliances function as much through expectation as through formal commitments. Part 6. How recent signals affected European calculations. Nowhere was this recalibration felt more acutely than in Europe. For decades, European security planning assumed a steady American role. Not absolute dominance, but consistent presence. When signals from Washington began to fluctuate, European leaders reassessed those assumptions. Defense discussions shifted in tone. Instead of focusing solely on integration within NATO, conversations expanded to include independent capacity, redundancy, and resilience. These were not expressions of rejection. They were responses to uncertainty. This recalibration extended beyond military planning. Diplomatic coordination became more cautious. Public messaging grew more measured. Strategic language emphasized autonomy without confrontation. European leaders avoided framing these shifts as reactions to any single decision. Instead, they described them as necessary adaptations to a changing environment. That phrasing was deliberate. It acknowledged alliance commitments while quietly preparing for variability. Importantly, these changes unfolded incrementally. There were no dramatic announcements, no formal breaks, no symbolic exits. The adjustments appeared in policy papers, budget debates, and institutional reviews. Slow, technical, but meaningful. Part 7. When alliance assumptions were quietly revised. As these recalibrations continued, one underlying assumption began to change. The assumption that American engagement would always arrive first. Allies started planning for scenarios where US involvement might be delayed, limited, or conditional. This did not imply abandonment of NATO principles. It reflected prudence. In an environment where policy signals fluctuate, resilience requires preparation. This shift had cascading effects. Regional cooperation gained prominence. Bilateral arrangements complemented multilateral ones. Defense initiatives diversified. Rather than relying on a single center of gravity, allies distributed risk. This approach reduced vulnerability, but also altered alliance dynamics. Coordination became more complex. Decision-making required broader consensus. Leadership became more diffuse. Crucially, these changes did not weaken NATO overnight, but they did transform its internal logic. The alliance began functioning less as a rigid structure and more as a flexible network. That flexibility offered advantages, but it also reduced clarity. And clarity has always been one of NATO's greatest strengths. As a result, concern among allies did not stem from immediate threats. It stemmed from ambiguity, from the growing gap between traditional expectations and emerging realities, and from the recognition that alliances built on predictability must adapt carefully when predictability erodes. Part 8. When disagreements became public. For much of NATO's history, disagreement followed a familiar pattern. Differences were managed privately, criticism was softened through diplomatic language, unity was preserved in public. This approach was not accidental. Public cohesion served a strategic purpose. It reassured populations, deterred adversaries, and reinforced the perception of collective strength. But in recent years, that pattern began to change. Concerns once expressed behind closed doors increasingly surfaced in public forums. Statements from Allied leaders grew more direct. Interviews signaled frustration. Joint declarations revealed carefully negotiated compromises rather than shared enthusiasm. These moments did not represent a sudden rupture. They reflected accumulated unease. Public disagreement carries weight. It signals not only difference of opinion, but reduced confidence in private mechanisms of coordination. When allies choose public channels, it often means internal assurances no longer feel sufficient. For NATO members, this shift was significant. It suggested that reassurance had become conditional and that uncertainty had reached a threshold where silence was no longer sustainable. Part 9. How specific issues tested alliance cohesion. Several issues brought these tensions into sharper focus, not because they were unprecedented, but because they intersected with existing concerns. Security commitments were one such issue. Statements questioning the automatic nature of defense guarantees raised alarms. Even when later clarified, the initial signal lingered. Allies understood that deterrence relies on clarity. Ambiguity, even rhetorical, complicates planning. Another pressure point emerged around strategic geography. Regions once treated as stable pillars of alliance planning suddenly became subjects of negotiation. This introduced an element of unpredictability into areas long considered settled. For European allies, geography is not abstract. It is history, it is proximity, it is vulnerability. When strategic priorities appear fluid, those closest to potential consequences react first. Economic and trade policies also played a role. Measures framed domestically as leverage sometimes created collateral effects for allies. Supply chains were disrupted. Industries faced uncertainty. Coordination suffered. Even when objectives aligned, methods diverged. Over time, allies began separating agreement on goals from concern over execution. That separation matters, because alliances function best when goals and methods reinforce each other. Part 10. When trust shifted from assumption to question. Trust is rarely binary. It does not disappear suddenly. It erodes gradually. Among NATO allies, trust did not collapse. It evolved. Assumptions that once felt stable became subjects of reassessment. Planning documents incorporated wider contingencies. Strategic reviews emphasized resilience over reliance. Language shifted toward preparation rather than expectation. This was not distrust, it was caution. Caution alters behavior. Allies invest in independent capabilities. They pursue redundancy. They strengthen regional coordination. These steps enhance security, but they also reflect adaptation to perceived variability. In effect, trust moved from an assumed constant to a variable factor. That shift is subtle but profound. Part 11. How NATO as an institution responded. Institutions tend to move slowly. NATO is no exception. Its strength lies in consensus, process, and gradual adjustment, rather than rapid transformation. As Allied concerns grew, institutional responses followed familiar patterns. Committees expanded discussions. Strategic concepts were revisited. Language was carefully balanced. Publicly, unity remained the emphasis. Privately, adaptation continued. NATO began placing greater emphasis on flexibility. Force posture planning incorporated multiple scenarios. Regional command structures gained prominence. Coordination mechanisms were refined. These adjustments were framed as modernization. But modernization often reflects underlying stress. Institutions modernize when environments change faster than existing frameworks. Part 12. When worry became a strategic consideration. At a certain point, concern itself became part of strategic calculation. Allies began factoring political variability into security planning. This represented a shift from threat-based planning to uncertainty-based planning. The difference is important. Threats can be identified. Uncertainty must be managed. Managing uncertainty requires options. As a result, alliance behavior became more layered. Commitments remained, but they were supplemented. Planning became more complex. Decision-making required broader consultation. Consensus took longer to achieve. This did not weaken NATO, but it changed how it functioned. The alliance increasingly resembled a network rather than a hierarchy. Coordination replaced direction, alignment replaced obedience. This structure offers resilience, but it also demands trust, not only in capabilities, but in intentions. And intentions, by their nature, are harder to measure. Part 13. Why worry does not mean withdrawal. It is important to distinguish concern from disengagement. NATO allies are not turning away from the United States. They are preparing for variability. That preparation reflects continued commitment, not abandonment. Allies worry precisely because the alliance matters. If it did not, adaptation would be unnecessary. Concern motivates adjustment. Adjustment preserves relevance. In this sense, worry can be stabilizing, but only if it is acknowledged and addressed. Ignoring concern allows uncertainty to deepen, and uncertainty, left unmanaged, reshapes alliances more profoundly than any single policy decision. Part 14. When alliances enter a phase of adaptation. Alliances rarely collapse suddenly. More often, they evolve. They adjust to new conditions, reinterpret old assumptions, and recalibrate expectations. NATO has entered such a phase, not because its purpose has disappeared, but because the environment in which it operates has changed. For decades, alliance behavior was shaped by a relatively stable hierarchy. Leadership flowed from the center. Coordination followed established patterns. Roles were clearly defined. As uncertainty increased, those patterns began to loosen. Adaptation does not mean fragmentation. It means flexibility. Allies now operate in a context where certainty cannot be assumed and where resilience depends on diversification. This shift encourages experimentation. New forms of cooperation emerge alongside traditional structures. Regional initiatives complement alliance-wide planning. Bilateral agreements operate within multilateral frameworks. The alliance becomes layered. This layered structure offers advantages. It absorbs shocks. It allows tailored responses. It reduces single points of failure. But it also demands higher levels of coordination, and coordination becomes harder as complexity increases. Part 15. How history offers a cautionary parallel. History provides useful perspective. Periods of alliance adjustment are not new. During the Cold War, NATO navigated internal disagreements over strategy, nuclear posture, and regional priorities. Yet the alliance endured because its members recognized a shared interest that outweighed friction. The lesson is not that disagreement weakens alliances. It is that unmanaged uncertainty does. In earlier eras, alignment was reinforced by clear external threats. Today's environment is more ambiguous. Threats are diffuse, challenges overlap, interests diverge across regions. This ambiguity places greater strain on alliance cohesion. It requires constant reaffirmation of purpose. History also shows that alliances struggle when leadership expectations and realities diverge. When partners plan for one set of behaviors and experience another, trust erodes. Restoring trust requires more than reassurance. It requires consistency. Part 16. Why American leadership faces a different test. The challenge facing the United States is not a loss of capability. It remains militarily dominant, economically influential, and diplomatically central. The challenge lies in perception. Leadership today is judged not only by strength, but by predictability. Allies assess not just what the United States can do, but how reliably it does it. In a world of instant communication and rapid political cycles, signals are amplified. Statements resonate globally. Policy shifts are scrutinized immediately. Ambiguity spreads quickly. This environment reduces the margin for error. Actions that once produced flexibility now generate uncertainty. As a result, leadership becomes more demanding. It requires restraint alongside strength, consultation alongside initiative, continuity alongside adaptation. Meeting these expectations consistently is difficult, but failure to do so accelerates hedging behavior among allies. Part 17. How allies are likely to behave going forward. Looking ahead, allied behavior is unlikely to follow a single path. Instead, several trends are likely to coexist. First, commitment will remain. NATO's core principles retain broad support. Collective defense remains central to European security. Second, autonomy will increase. Allies will continue investing in independent capabilities. Regional cooperation will deepen. Redundancy will become a feature rather than an exception. Third, consultation will matter more. Allies will expect clearer signals, earlier engagement, and greater transparency. Surprises will be met with caution. Predictability will be valued over speed. These behaviors do not undermine the alliance. They reflect adaptation to an environment where certainty is scarce. Part 18. What this means for the global order. NATO does not exist in isolation. Its evolution affects the broader international system. As alliances become more flexible, global order becomes less hierarchical. Power diffuses across institutions, regions, and coalitions. Leadership becomes situational. This diffusion does not eliminate cooperation. It complicates it. Coordination requires negotiation across multiple centers of influence. Consensus takes longer to build, but when achieved, it may prove more durable. For global stability, this shift carries both risk and opportunity. Risk because fragmentation can weaken deterrence. Opportunity because shared responsibility can reduce over-reliance on any single actor. Part 19. Why worry may be a stabilizing force. Concern among allies is often framed negatively, but worry can serve a constructive role. It prompts reflection. It encourages preparation. It motivates dialogue. Allies worry because they care about outcomes. In this sense, worry reflects engagement, not disengagement. It signals that the alliance remains relevant enough to adapt. Complacency, not concern, poses the greater danger. The critical question is how worry is addressed. If it is dismissed, uncertainty deepens. If it is acknowledged, adaptation becomes cooperative. Part 20. What will shape the next phase? The future of NATO and Allied confidence will be shaped by choices. Not dramatic gestures, but accumulated decisions. Consistency over time, clarity in communication, respect for institutional processes. Leadership will be measured not by declarations, but by patterns. Allies will watch not for perfection, but for reliability. The test is not whether disagreements occur. They always will. The test is whether trust survives them. Part 21. When alliances endure. Alliances endure when they adapt without losing purpose. NATO has demonstrated this capacity before. Its current phase is another chapter in a long history of adjustment. The outcome is not predetermined. It depends on how uncertainty is managed and how leadership responds to a world that no longer accepts it automatically. Concern among allies does not signal the end of alliance politics. It signals a transition, a moment when expectations are renegotiated. And moments of renegotiation often determine whether institutions stagnate or evolve.